moving forward from the UN Declaration, in 1992, the first time that Native peoples actually were involved at international level on environmental negotiations. And that was at the Rio Summit, Summit held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, which is a big summit. 192 countries were represented there. And this is the summit that, for the first time, created climate change negotiations, as well as negotiations on biological diversity, which are just underway in Japan in the past few weeks. And it was also very important because it was the first time that the international community understood and recognized and affirmed a number of Indigenous rights in a certain sense, Indigenous knowledge in a lot of ways, but also the fact that Indigenous peoples had a unique and distinct relationship with their environments and with preserving and protecting the local ecologies as well as the biodiversity that was to be found in the territories. As I mentioned, as a result of those negotiations, we had the creation of the climate change talks, but which from the beginning have been plagued by a number of difficulties, a number of problems, and that they've been very sort of technical and dominated by a lot of northern states, like Canada and the US, but as well as by a number of businesses who really see these opportunities talking about climate change as just another way to make profit. In Canada, though, it's important to acknowledge the fact that Inuit people and some other communities have been talking about climate change for dozens of years, long before scientists, long before Western scientists, had ever come up and put a name on the issue. They've been talking about the changes that they've been seeing, and noting a lot of the severe and extreme impacts in their communities. And as a result of that, as a result of the Inuit, going to international negotiations as well, that Indigenous peoples first started going to these negotiations in 1998 to 1999 with a small number of participants, but growing every year, such that in 2007, the first year I was attending the climate change negotiations, there was about 40 Indigenous representatives from around the world. Last year, 2009, in Copenhagen, there was about 300 from just about every country that has Indigenous peoples around the world. And we really found that we had a similar experience to a lot of other marginalized groups that have attended these climate change negotiations, everything from farmers to women's groups, to youth groups, to human rights organizations, as well as even union representatives. They've all sort of experienced the same sort of isolation, the same sort of lack of concern for their points of view and their issues. But what Indigenous peoples have been really doing, really trying to do is sort of convey, a lot of their concerns, convey a lot of their possible or particular contributions to climate change, in particular with reference to Indigenous knowledge, and also trying to secure protection for Indigenous rights in their own communities, in their own countries. And I just want to just sort of go briefly through, what most of these demands, most of these statements have been, because I think they're really important and also really fit well talking about some of the particulars of that Bob and Marcelo would talk about, just as a broad framework. What we sort of see is that Indigenous peoples have been forming and formulating a new type of Indigenous knowledge at these climate change negotiations, and have really been demanding a number of things in a few key areas. In no particular order, they've been demanding very stringent emissions reductions, understanding that their communities are most impacted by any other communities in the world. A relationship with the earth that's based on a sort of spiritual connection and traditional connection, but that's also non-materialist and non-commercial. A concern for Indigenous participation at all levels of negotiations and within countries as well. A respect for Indigenous knowledge, as well as a critique of the capitalist economic systems and using market mechanisms as a means to solve climate change. So, giving businesses the main responsibilities to solve climate change, as well as a number of development and technological projects in general. Indigenous communities have been key in promoting a holistic sense of environmental integrity, above and beyond the very technical, scientific, and Western science-oriented discussions of climate change. And they've also been very distrustful and very challenging of governments and corporations involved in those negotiations as well. The other big piece has been focused on collective rights, particularly the control of lands, territories, and resources, and with concern for Indigenous rights as well. And what this has done is really opened up the space to a lot of other groups that have attended these negotiations to be able to talk about human rights as well, to be able to talk about, farmers' rights or women's rights, because before Indigenous groups were at the UN, there had been never any mention of human rights there, which is kind of incredible when you come to think about all of the ways that people will be impacted by climate change. But these negotiations have been dominated by northern institutions, northern academics, scientists, and businesses as well. And so they wanted to avoid talking about anything icky like human rights by all means necessary. And I think it's also key to understand that Indigenous groups have also been on the forefront of developing this critique of economic systems, but also understanding that these Western economic systems of capitalism and commercialism are also linked to processes of colonialism, and trying to really push that understanding to other members of the environmental community in other parts of the world, who for the most part don't really have an understanding, don't really know the history of Indigenous peoples, and don't really understand how colonialism has shaped our collective experiences in different parts of the world. And the other sort of really big challenge has been that Indigenous peoples have been really trying to challenge a lot of the false solutions being put forward in these negotiations. And it's because of the impacts on their communities that a lot of these, what I'm calling false solutions, have, that they threaten Indigenous peoples in a lot of ways, including terminating or ending community sovereignty, displacing communities, disruptions of traditional practices, state and even private violence against community members, as well as land grabs caused by these initiatives that lack any sense of free, prior, and informed consent from the communities, but also sort of lacking sort of environmental integrity as well. And these are some of the projects that in Canada we've been told are good green projects in other parts of the world. Things like dams, building massive hydroelectric dams in many places, displaced or wiped out communities, and starting to do some of the same things here in Canada. Biofuel plantations, have actually managed to cut down vast parts of the Amazon and disrupt and displace Amazon communities from those areas. Tree plantations, wind farms, and other carbon offset projects are all sort of examples of some of these things that have really threatened the human rights of Indigenous communities around the world, all supposedly in the name of stopping climate change, but in the end, disrupting the very people who are actually, working to maintain and preserve those very environments. And so it's been a bit of a hypocritical sort of thing by a lot of these governments to really try and not object to and stop Indigenous rights in these negotiations. Because if we really were serious about stopping climate change, then we have to come to understand that one of the best things that we can do would be to enforce Indigenous rights and enforce Indigenous sovereignty in various parts of the world, and give back title and sovereignty to Indigenous communities from whom it's been taken away. Outside of just the formal negotiations, though, Indigenous communities in Canada and abroad have been active in other places as well. Not just the climate change negotiations, also the UN Human Rights Committees, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the World Food Program, and a number of other areas as well. But also participating in non-official forums, things like the World Social Forum, the US Social Forum, other massive gatherings of civil society. And within the past few years, maybe 2 years, have really taken initiatives to organize Indigenous gatherings, Indigenous-led gatherings as well. And that's what we sort of seen here, the Indigenous Peoples Global Summit on Climate Change, which was held in Alaska and organized by a number of Inuit communities 2 years ago, as well as the gathering, the World Peoples Gathering on the Rights of Mother Earth held in Cochabamba earlier this year, to which myself and Bob were also attendees. And so what happened there was, as a result of Copenhagen being a massive failure, in front of the eyes of the world last year. You have the graphic here, it says Copenhagen, which was the posters they had everywhere in Copenhagen, becoming Brokenhagen. Evo Morales, who was actually attending the climate change negotiations here, as were a majority of so-called world leaders from everywhere, made the announcement that because these climate change negotiations have failed, because countries have been unable to come up with any long-term plan for collective survival, he invited members of indigenous peoples, of civil society, and governments from around the world to attend a gathering that would be organized in Bolivia. And he put this on the week surrounding Earth Day in April. And as a result, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but we had over 30,000 people that attended this gathering. And a lot of the demands, a lot of the discussions that came out really reflect a lot of those positions that I've already talked about. And sort of reflect a broader sense within indigenous communities, especially in South America, that this experiment, with Western economic systems and Western political systems has really failed. And doesn't have any long-term solutions for us. And it's not just led to the climate crisis, but led to a state of general crisis around the world. It's led to the energy crisis, the food crisis, the water crisis, biodiversity crisis. And a lot of these things are what our elders have been saying for a long time, for what our peoples have been trying to communicate. And now find ourselves having to go into different areas, different forums, to really try and reiterate. And I think it's sort of incumbent to really try and consider that a lot, these are very different kind of proposals. But continuing on the same path we're going today isn't going to solve any of these crises. Isn't going to solve any of the problems. We're not going to solve it just by changing a number of light bulbs here in Canada. We really have to reconsider our relationships with each other as humans and with Mother Earth as well. And we have to really start changing our systems of values, how we understand and value one another as human beings, but also Mother Earth. Because a lot of the outcomes of these negotiations has been to say, well, maybe if we just put a price on carbon, maybe if we just put a price on trees, maybe if we just traded these in the market, we could stop climate change. And indigenous peoples have been saying for many years, that's not enough. That's not going to lead us in anywhere useful. Because if we just try to apply the same old economic models, that's gotten us nowhere quick. And here in Canada, we really have an obligation to start at home, because we have one of the biggest environmental disasters that's creeping up on us in northern Alberta, but it's rapidly spreading to other parts of the country, and it's rapidly expanding to other countries as well, as Canadian companies seek newer and more exciting places to cut down forests, take out precious resources, or extract things like oil and coal. And so Canada's domestic policy has really, what's really been fueling a lot of their international work. So changing and challenging that, would lead to opening up a lot of spaces, and making a lot more possible for other countries, for other indigenous peoples around the world as well. But because we have to understand that the refusal to entertain the idea of indigenous rights for any indigenous community in anywhere in the world, the international level, is related to their inability to consider indigenous rights domestically and to consider concepts like indigenous sovereignty. And so, that's why in Canada we have a number of crucial battles that I think that we should be fighting. But we also have to be understanding that this indigenous sovereignty movement is really key and central to achieving environmental justice, and should be one of the central focuses for all environmental organizations and for anybody that considers themselves interested in environmental sustainability in the long term. And we had this publication. It wasn't by us, but it was by people that we work with, Climate Justice Montreal. And it's called 10 Indigenous Struggles that Canadian Climate and Environmental Activists Should Support. And there are more copies of this available outside, but I encourage people to take a look at some of these. They cover a number of different communities and things going on across the country that are very important battles in terms of not just Indigenous sovereignty, but the long-term sustainability of our planet, really. And so I want to just conclude by saying, Indigenous peoples from here, from other parts of the world, have really shown ourselves as leading the struggles of re-envisioning our relationships with each other and with Mother Earth. And right now, we need countries like Canada to either get out of the way or to follow. And for the rest of society to stand up and fight for Indigenous rights, sovereignty, and justice. So, go on. Thank you very much.